I'm Alfred Perlman. I'm a railroad man, and I'd like to tell you something about our railroad and what we're doing on it. People tend to take the railroad pretty much for granted. We in the railroad business probably haven't told the story of the changing conditions in our...
I'm Phil Bell. I'm a railroad man too, and trains are in my blood. Today, railroads are telling the story of everything they do for America, right here on the All Aboard podcast.
Hey everybody, Phil Bell here with the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains. It's great to be back with you. I have not had a chance to do one of these episodes since September. And I know, you said, Phil, you were hanging out, no simp September, you must have gotten caught simping or something happened. But I wanted to give you a little explanation as to why our long form podcasts tend to be a little bit jumpy before we dive into today's topic, which is the Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger, taking a deep dive into the application that was just filed yesterday. Now, a little housekeeping, talking about us as a podcast and what you can expect. I love each and every one of you, and doing this show for you is truly a gas. Whether we have 5 viewers or 500,000 or otherwise, it's always a lot of fun. However, especially for those of you who catch us on YouTube, we have to fight with YouTube to get impressions. The people who run that place, for whatever reason, they don't think it matters enough to let you know that this show is on the air. Now, I could go on about how they're rotten. I could go on about how I hope that they get Penn Centraled. I could go on about how I hope they get Conrailed. But in reality, we have got to live with what they're doing. So, the way that we solve this problem and make it possible for me to do this show once again regularly is for you to like, share, and subscribe, and share this with other people, because that is how we will overcome all of the algorithmic insanity and the people at YouTube who clearly do not like trains as much as we do. Now, today is December 20th, 2025. There's only 5 days until Christmas. I haven't done any shopping, but we are here at the Greenberg's Train and Toy Show in Chantilly. This will be the last one that will take place here at the Dulles Expo Center. So I hope you will come out and join us and stop by and see us. We're here live. We'll be here today, and of course we'll be here through the close of the show on Sunday, December 21st. Unfortunately, IKEA is going to put a store. I'm sorry, I don't know where I've lost my words. They're going to put a store here, and while we love the Swedes, we love the beautiful women they have there, we love the AEM 7s, the RC4s, everything they created. We don't really care all that much for the furniture, especially when it's taken away the place where we like to meet and trade trains and everything else with each other. So come out, enjoy this before they make it into an IKEA, and we will go on from there. Now, in the last episode that we did in September, this was not long after Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern had decided they were going to merge to create the first true coast-to-coast railroad. Now, if you think back, we have heard a lot, especially in school, about the Transcontinental Railroad. But the reality is the Transcontinental Railroad, which went from the Midwest, roughly Omaha, Nebraska, the Union Pacific, the eastern end of it, to what's now the Bay Area of California, Sacramento, on to Oakland, on to San Francisco, was not a true transcontinental railroad. Yes, it did go from what we then called at the time the Midwest to the West, but of course it didn't go to the East. And there were very few railroads that actually crossed the real barrier, which I would consider to be the Mississippi River, roughly. Chicago, St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans being those areas where railroads from the east met railroads from the west. Now, as time went on, these places started to change. You started to see the growth in Kansas City. That has become the preeminent place in the middle of the country where railroads of the east and railroads of the west like to join up. Obviously, Chicago is still the biggest, but Kansas City is now probably the most important. You've also seen a growth in the number of railroads that do transit the Mississippi River. probably one of the earliest that was the most successful was the Milwaukee Road. Most people think of the Milwaukee Road as being the Milwaukee Road going to Milwaukee. But let's remember, it was not only a Chicago-based railroad, but to the east it went as far as Louisville, Kentucky, which is east of the Mississippi, and to the west it went all the way to Tacoma, Washington, thanks to its Pacific extension. So that was one example. As time went on in the 1970s and the 1980s, you started to see some of the western railroads start to creep east. The first being the Burlington Northern. When the Burlington Northern acquired the Frisco, the St. Louis, San Francisco, they acquired the Frisco's line to Pensacola, Florida. So I always appreciated as a kid doing a lot of my growing up in Tallahassee that if you really wanted to see something other than CSX, then you could go not far to Pensacola and get a branch line of the mighty Burlington Northern Railroad. Yes, they did go to Pensacola, and that was one example of the railroads breaking that Mississippi River barrier, western railroads, and coming on east. Another one, which is a little bit older but no less important, was of course the Wabash. And the Wabash played a very important role moving traffic from the eastern segments of the Midwest into the eastern segments of the West. Let's not forget, not only did they travel as far as Buffalo via southern Ontario, but they went as far west as Omaha, Nebraska, or I should say Council Bluffs, Nebraska, Council Bluffs, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, that area. And some of their tracks still does exist in that area, but they went directly to the western railroads in the West. So, noteworthy. But you still do not have single line service in the United States where one railroad controls a single line all the way from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. However, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are hoping to change that in 2027 with their landmark merger, and they just filed their application with the Surface Transportation Board. Now, for a quick breakdown, the way this is generally supposed to work is two railroads decide they want to merge in some form. That could be one buying the other. That could be a merger of equals where they create a common holding company and both railroads are put under that holding company and create a single system. Or it could be something along the lines of what you see from the portfolio short line operators like Genesee and Wyoming, where that company goes around and buys up a bunch of little railroads or smaller railroads, and they don't necessarily combine themselves into a single carrier. But with Union, and so when you do this, the way it works is, actually there's two ways. The first is called the exemption process. So if tomorrow we are able to generate enough money through this YouTube thing and Rumble and Spotify that I have enough money to go buy a railroad, I'll reach a deal with the seller, and then I'll go to the Surface Transportation Board and file what's called an exemption. And the exemption exempts me from having to go through the entire long, drawn-out evaluation process for a railroad merger. And that can be very, very deep. And a great example of that is what happened with the Union Pacific Rock Island merger. And now you're probably thinking, but Phil, there was no Union Pacific Rock Island merger. You're right. That's because the merger review went on for so long and the Rock Island continued to fall apart so greatly that the Union Pacific said, we're washing our hands of this. We don't want to buy that railroad anymore. And that carrier subsequently collapsed and was abandoned in 1980 entirely. Now that doesn't mean that parts of it aren't still run, but they did shut it down on one day in 1980. Now, I'll go back a second. So the exemption process will file that, and the Surface Transportation Board will look at it and say, yep, this is indeed not a major merger. It's not a Class 1 railroad acquiring another. It's not someone who owns a Class 1 railroad acquiring another railroad. So we will go ahead and agree there's no real impact here and sign off on it, and it will be effective on date X. And then when that date comes, then I can take over the railroad, I can bring out all of my E8s, I can bring out all of my awesome passenger cars, and we can have the best railroad excursions ever. Oh my gosh, I'm telling you guys my business plan, forget I said that. Yeah, steam engines too, don't worry, we'll have that. But for a larger transaction, like Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern, it's entirely different. Not only do you have to file a full application that details everything. Why are you merging? Who are you? What do you think is going to happen? Where is your money coming from? What type of competitive disadvantages will be created by this merger? What kind of environmental impacts will there be? What is going to happen? Now, I'm a free marketer. You know that, and our friends over at the Center for Transportation Advancement who are simulcasting this episode agree with me that it makes no sense that you have to go through this entire process. But for railroads, this is the process that you must go through. It has one benefit to it, and that is, for the most part, the federal government recognizes the authority of the Surface Transportation Board as a specialized and independent regulatory agency to make these decisions as in respect to competitiveness, as opposed to allowing the Department of Justice and the arbitrary antitrust enforcement to take place the way it does in almost every other industry. So other industries, businesses in other industries do have to make applications and let Uncle Sam know what they're up to and so on. But usually you'll have another regulator like the Federal Trade Commission or something like that, or Nuclear Regulatory Commission if nuclear power plants are involved, FERC, or if it's related to energy, get involved. But in the case of the service, but that does not also mean that the Department of Justice will not get involved and just decide, you know what? Antitrust, you're destroying this market, you're destroying that by having your merger, and we're taking you to court. And that, as you've seen, can not only be the death knell for a particular merger, but it can be the death knell for a particular company if the merger does not work out. Case in point, Spirit Airlines. The Spirit Airlines was killed by the Biden Department of Justice, who decided to disallow, arbitrarily by the way, their merger with JetBlue. Now Spirit has been bankrupt twice since then, and everything that they claimed would happen, which is that we would lose access to cheap airline tickets and ostensibly people beating each other up on the airplane, well, we're losing it anyway because Spirit is going bankrupt in absence of doing that transaction. But the railroads have the luxury of dealing with the Surface Transportation Board, and while it is not impossible for the Department of Justice to come along and cause trouble, it is highly unlikely that they will do so. So the application gets filed, and then you have a combination of hearings, examinations. You will have weighing in from members of Congress, the executive branch, all before the Surface Transportation Board makes its decision. And not only can the decision be appealed, it can be appealed if it's denied by the railroads. It can be appealed if it is accepted by other people who are still upset that they didn't get their way. And that can be short line railroads who wanted to buy a piece of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. That can be shippers who don't believe that they are getting a good enough deal. That can be localities and states who are, whether valid or invalid, believe that they still have a gripe because the system did not take into account enough what they would like. And after all of that, the transaction becomes effective. But even then, things are not done. Because in many cases, you will see that reporting requirements are given to the new railroad. And in theory, if various conditions are not met that are imposed, in theory, the transaction could be undone or other conditions could be imposed later on. So, if this gives you an idea about how deeply in-depth this process is, that should show you what is happening and why it is so critical and such a great risk for Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern to be taking this path. And that means they truly do believe that it will not only be beneficial to them as companies, as a combined business, but it will also be something that grows their business as opposed to just saving it. So what I want to do is go through this and give you a little bit of background here or there so you will understand what you're looking at and why. And the first thing we're going to start with is the docket number. And you're probably thinking, Phil, look, I'm not a lawyer. I don't care about dockets. This doesn't mean anything to me. You will want to know the docket number because this is something that will be tracked not only for the 2 roughly years that it is likely to take for the merger to be reviewed and hopefully approved. And by the way, I am on record as saying I am a very, very, very strong supporter of this merger, what I think will be great. But also as far as reviews are concerned, as far as appeals after the merger are concerned, as far as reports are being filed, as far as monitoring and so on. So this will go on for years. So you will want to know that docket number, and that is FD 36873. So if you go to the Surface Transportation Board website, which is www.stb.gov, and you want to see what the latest is, put that in, search FD 36873. FD stands for Finance Docket. You will not be sorry. And I know for anybody who thinks, well, Phil, you just got way too nerdy on me, trust me, you will be very, very happy you know that. Now, I downloaded this onto my computer. I'm surprised the computer still works. It is 6,694 PDF pages when you download it, and that's all the exhibits, that's all the support letters, that's all of the submissions by executives, verifications, everything that goes in, and it cost a whopping $2,253,600 just to file the application. Now, I want you to think about that in context. If I had $2,253,600, I could, in fact, buy, refurbish, and get ready to operate on the main line, maybe not with full PTC, but with a lot of that equipment, some E-units and passenger cars, and have enough money to market the business and everything else in order to run some excursion trains. But they paid that money to the federal government, the Surface Transportation Board, just to have the transaction considered. Shows you what level that we're operating at. So, the first part of this that I wanted to go through, and I'm going to just kind of read through a few of these, going to page 159 of the initial of volume 1, we have a statement by Jim Venna, and Jim Venna is a very interesting person. He is going to be the CEO of the combined company. And he's currently the CEO of the Union Pacific, came over from Canadian National, and he has been a real outspoken business leader overall, not just being a CEO in the rail industry. So he starts out by saying, my name is Jim Venna. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Union Pacific Corporation and Union Pacific Railroad Company. I have served in this role since August of 2023. I previously served as UP's Chief Operating Officer from 2019 to 2020 and responsible for all operations, technology, and strategy. And what I thought was so interesting about this is once you get past some of the things such as upon approval, we will immediately improve safety, service, and efficiency by activating a consolidated transportation plan to eliminate approximately 2,400 handlings of cars and containers per day and approximately 60,000 car miles per day for traffic currently interchanged between UP and Norfolk Southern. Once you get past that, there was a very interesting story about Mr. Venna's life. And it comes here starting on page 163 of volume 1. And he says, after my first year in college, I joined Canadian National Railway as an entry-level train crew member, then known as a brakeman, pulling pins and tying brakes in rail yards. From there, I advanced to more senior train crew positions, first as a conductor and later as a locomotive engineer, working in both rail yards, switching cars, and in over-the-road service handling long-haul movements. I maintained my union seniority by operating trains on weekends throughout college. By working and studying and negotiating work schedules, I graduated without any loans or debts. I want you to think about that for a second, especially those of you who are saying, well, I've got a kid that I'm going to put through college. What are they going to do? How much are they going to take in loans or otherwise? Jim Venna the current CEO of the Union Pacific Railroad and the person likely to be leading the combined Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern, worked his way through college on the Canadian National Railway by serving as a locomotive engineer in both over-the-road and local rail service, and graduated debt-free. Now, I imagine some of this would be very difficult to do today, given the stratospheric prices that a lot of colleges and universities are charging. And by the way, please like, share, and subscribe, because here at the All Aboard Podcast by All Things Trains, any money we get comes from you. We cannot get any loans from the government. Heck, I could barely get student loans from the government when I was a student in college, because they kind of knew how that was going to turn out. So it's up to you to support this channel and keep us on the air. But I want to end that section with this from Mr. Vena. I take pride in the fact that I'm the only railroad CEO with experience operating trains, which gives me valuable insights into the challenges and possibilities of rail operations from the ground up. Now, I'm not somebody that believes that you need to work all the way up from the bottom to the top in order to lead a particular company. In fact, I think that if this is done consistently, it puts the company at a disadvantage, because pretty soon you get a lot of people who are really only able to understand the narrow industry they work in, as opposed to how that industry interacts with a variety of others. But that does not mean it is not a great thing on occasion, and it is really exciting to read about Mr. Vena and what he said there about his background, working his way through college, and from there becoming now the CEO of the largest railroad in America. And by the way, even though he is a Canadian, Jim Vena, and I've listened to him speak in person, and it really is something special. He loves this country, and he loves the Union Pacific Railroad. And if you've ever met anybody from UP, they take a lot of pride in the fact that their charter was signed by Abraham Lincoln. They take a lot of pride in the fact that the American flag is a part of their logo. So that says a lot about who Mr. Vena is, and the pride he takes in leading Union Pacific and what he is hoping to do there. Now, as we go on to the next person here, that is Mark George, and he starts his testimony on page 188. And he said something that's also very interesting, and I'll quote from there. It starts by saying, why is the U.S. rail industry, and this is his statement in the Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger application, why is the U.S. rail industry falling behind? Now, when I saw that, I thought that was incredibly audacious for anyone, let alone the CEO of a publicly traded railroad, to say in a document this consequential. You've got to think about that. If you ever take the time to listen to any kind of business media going on, watching CNBC, Fox Business, reading the Wall Street Journal, reading a 10K form, reading an annual report, you will see that much of what is said is intentionally opaque, and it is almost always positive. Oh, well, you know, we saw a slight weakness and headwinds in this or that, but at the end of the day, what they want to tell you is something really good. The only time they will ever look up and tell you, hey, we've got a problem, or something is not outstanding, perfect, and please buy the stock, is when there is real, deep-seated concern about the future of that enterprise in particular, or that industry. So seeing that line, why is the U.S. rail industry falling behind, is critical. From 1980 through 2000, U.S. freight rail made tremendous progress, driven by the Staggers Act deregulation and a new focus on efficiency. During this period, railroads consolidated, shed excess capacity, and invested heavily in operations. And the short line industry grew by leaps and bounds. Those changes produced decades of productivity and financial stability. And you know all of this. If you've been following this channel, or you've been reading books, or you've been reading Trains Magazine, by the way, published by our good friends at Firecrown Media, please subscribe to that after you have subscribed to allthingstrains.com and our YouTube channel. You know that railroads really did boom starting in the 1980s. It was unheard of to talk about a railroad that was in financial trouble. It was unheard of to talk about a railroad going bankrupt. It was unheard of to talk about a railroad that was in decline. The Staggers Rail Act was such a boon. The idea of getting as close as possible as you can get in the United States to a free market for transportation, the Staggers Act provided that, as provided, and continues to do so. And it has convinced so much more traffic to go back to the rails after spending 4 decades of that traffic, 4 to 5 decades really, fleeing from the rails. But, and here's the big but, after the consolidations of the late 90s, the industry enjoyed several years of growth prompted by significant investment and by unlocking the potential of the new, larger networks we had created. Hold on, I lost my train of thought right there. All right. For example, after Norfolk Southern stabilized our Conrail acquisition, that's 58% of Conrail, we realized intermodal growth of over 1 million units, almost 50%. This would not have happened but for the industry consolidation. But as we entered the Great Recession, growth had already begun to plateau, and most railroads suffered significant reductions in business in 2009 and 2010. While there are many reasons for that, including service volatility, the decline in coal, and the acceleration of logistics demands for our customers, 2 factors stand out to me as key drivers of malaise. First, U.S. domestic industrial production stagnated as China entered the World Trade Organization and manufacturing left our shores for cheaper overseas locations. Second, while consolidation of the U.S. rail industry might have been the best response to all of these factors, merger activity among major railroads came to a stop, leaving the industry to operate under a fragmented structure that forces costly interchanges between carriers, adds complexity, and erodes accountability. This lack of integration continues to make rail less competitive than it could be because customers prioritize simplicity and reliability even when rail is cheaper and greener. And that's something that I want you to think about very, very deeply as followers of the rail industry and participants. It's not a big deal for us to think about that Railroad X, and let's say that Railroad X is the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad, showing up at some place like Huntington, Indiana, uncoupling a bunch of cars from a train and parking those cars for the Norfolk and Western to take over and speed those cars down to St. Louis or Kansas City. And then when they get to Kansas City, let's just say, that then they get added to a, let's say, who are we thinking of? Maybe Rock Island, maybe Missouri Pacific or something like that, one of their trains to get taken even further west, or Santa Fe. We think that's normal, but most people don't think that's normal. For most people, when they deal with a business, when they deal with shipping, they call somebody like FedEx and say, hey, I want you to move this stuff. And then they give them the stuff and pay, and then the stuff gets taken to wherever it's going, and the recipient receives it, and all is done. They don't think about, well, it has to be interchanged from here to there, somebody's got to get it, inspect it, make sure that everything is fine, make sure they're able to move it a certain way, and blah, blah, blah. They do not understand the circuitry, and to a very good extent, that circuitry, however we might romanticize it, makes it much more difficult for us to execute a very, very high volume business that competes aggressively with other modes of transportation. And I want you to do something that's really interesting. If you're ever along the mighty Mississippi, I want you to take a look at how much barge traffic moves up and down the Mississippi, and then I want you to take a look at how much traffic moves along the main line of Mid-America, Canadian National's former Illinois Central. Or take a look at how many trucks that you'll see on a highway like I-81 versus how many trains that you might see on Norfolk Southern's line to Bristol, Virginia, and down into the southeast. Now, to a certain extent, because trains are aggregators, you will see fewer trains than you will see truck movements. But if you take the time to watch the truck movements or you take the time to watch the barge movements, you will realize that so much of the competition has us beat from the starting gate. And that's not because I want to be negative on our industry. No, not by any means. I love this industry. As I said, I've spent thousands of dollars and thousands of hours of my own time, and it's probably more than that when you really consider it, to buy my own railroad. And one day I'll, like I said, have a very large one that you all can come ride on our excursions and our passenger trains. But it is a great industry, but we are at a disadvantage when we have to interchange between companies. That's why Mark George is saying things like this: efforts to combine not just service lanes, but make it so that you, the individual, can simply dial a number and say, hey, I want to send my goods from point A to point B. Point A is located in Hudson, Ohio. Point B is located in Bakersfield, California. Can you handle it? And as Union Pacific would say, we can handle it. And that's it. And there's no circuitry. It's just up to them to figure out the best route on their network, get it from point A to point B. That is what Mark George is highlighting in his statement about the Norfolk Southern Union Pacific merger. And one more key piece I wanted to check out, and let me just scroll down here. This is a little bit of what happens when we are doing something from a document so big. Let's see, we're going to pages 56, 60. Give me 1 second here. I do 5596 to 5598. Bear with me a moment, and we will. Oh, yes. I wanted to highlight some of the companies that are still owned or are owned as subsidiaries under Norfolk Southern, because you have to list every company that you have some noteworthy level of control in, and these are very interesting. First, T-Cubed North America. That was Norfolk Southern's effort to monetize the dark fiber that was on its right-of-way. They laid a lot of it, and they were hoping to make that into a very strong business. Now, we have never been able to find out, and this, by the way, late 90s, early to mid-2000s effort, haven't been able to find out if they've ever generated substantial revenue with this, but T-Cubed is something that they did market, and the leader of T-Cubed for quite some time was none other than Wick Moorman before he ascended to being CEO of the entire Norfolk Southern. As you go down, you'll see the Alabama Great Southern Railway. That is a good portion of the Alabama division and possibly even a part of the very, very western part of the Georgia division, but the AGS does exist, and you might have seen its sublettering on locomotives such as their E8s, which, as you know, I am very much fond of. The Central Georgia Railroad Company. This is not the original Central of Georgia. This was a reorganization of the original Central of Georgia, which at one time was controlled by the Illinois Central, but for whatever reason, neither they nor the St. Louis San Francisco, who had also controlled it, decided to merge it in, and that left it available to be merged by the Southern Railway, and it is now part of Norfolk Southern. And the reason why I mention this is just think of how dramatically different the railroad map would have looked if the Illinois Central, which primarily operated between Chicago and New Orleans, but also went out as far west as Omaha and under Canadian National does once again. Imagine what would have happened had they gone as far east as Atlanta and potentially the Atlantic coast through the Central Georgia. And keep in mind, they controlled that carrier into the 1950s, and that's how the Central Georgia had two E8s that were painted in Illinois Central colors to handle some of the Illinois Central passenger trains that operated over its rails, such as the city of Miami. You have the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific. You know that as the Rat Hole. That's the railroad that owns the Cincinnati Southern and has been a key subsidiary for the Southern and now Norfolk Southern for quite some time. And you have others such as Norfolk and Portsmouth Beltline and Yadkin Railroad Company. So a little bit of interesting railroads there. And then it says, in addition, NS owns direct or indirect equity interest in Conrail, Consolidated Rail Corporation, and Green Acquisition Corp. And Green Acquisition Corp is, of course, the merger subsidiary that Norfolk Southern created when they were taking over their portion of Conrail, or I should say, attempting to bid with CSX to take over Conrail in the 1990s. Now, we are going to go ahead and get out of here. I encourage you to take some time and go and read this merger application. What I gave you were some overviews so I could point to some key issues that were, or are, I should say, in the merger and themes that you will like to follow as time goes on. I'll also point out that what you're really looking at and what's really so critical is that Norfolk Southern and Union Pacific are going to have to demonstrate that they are not only doing something that's in the public interest, but they are going to find a way to increase competition. This is something that is very, very new, because no matter how good a business plan you have, no matter how good an idea that you would put out there, it's very hard to say, my business plan is going to cause more people to do something. Not even if I have a business plan to say sell, soda at a five and dime store. It's very unlikely to say yes, the number of people who are going to buy soda is going to increase by 20% in this area simply because it's going to be available at the store. Well, likewise, Union Pacific Norfolk Southern saying we are going to increase competition and market share, and this is how, as a result of what we're doing, is a very difficult thing to say. And so it will be interesting to see how the Surface Transportation Board navigates this. It will be interesting to see how the Trump administration navigates this. And of course, it will be interesting to see how the applicants themselves navigate it, and to what extent other participants, whether we're talking about shippers or short lines or prospective operators or you name it, decide to get involved, and what they will say. And oh, by the way, I almost forgot, wild card, Amtrak, what will they say? What will passengers say? Now, one last thing that I thought was really interesting. There are a myriad of letters of support for the transaction, and they've come from all corners. They've come from policy organizations, municipalities, states, shippers. But there was one thing that I thought was really cool. There is a state senator from Ohio, from Cuyahoga County, named Thomas F. Patton, who submitted a letter of support. Now you're probably wondering, Phil, what does Thomas F. Patton have to do with all this? Why does it matter? Well, remember, my all-time favorite railroad is the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad, even though we proved in one of our early episodes that the Erie-Lackawanna probably should not have been created in the first place. Well, when the Erie-Lackawanna went bankrupt and they appointed two trustees to run the property under Section 77 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, the trustees, one of them was named Ralph S. Tyler Jr., the other was named Thomas F. Patton. Now, I looked back at this state senator's biography to see if he was related to that Thomas F. Patton, and I have not been able to find any information. So this coming week on Monday, I'm going to go ahead and call his office and just say, hey, are you related to Thomas F. Patton, who used to run Lubrizol Corporation and eventually ran the or I shouldn't say ran, but served as a trustee of the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad in its bankruptcy. He states in his biography that he's the son of a cop and had a blue collar growing up, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be a family relationship. And I think it's noteworthy that you have two Clevelander area individuals with the same name, same middle initial, Thomas F. Patton, and they have both, in a way, made their mark on railroading. So as always, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay free right here on the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains.